I'd like to welcome everybody back. A lot of you have been at some of the other talks that I've given, whether in person or online. My name is Stephen Kraft, and before we get through this, I should make a few statements. One is that I'm not a rabbi. I'm also not a historian. I'm not a professor of history or linguistics. I'm also not a biblical scholar in the sort of true sense of the word. I'm actually an eye specialist for children. But in my little bits of spare time over many decades, I've had this passionate interest in trying to learn about the events and narratives in the Bible, and in specifically how science, the various areas of science that I've been exposed to or read about over the years, how they can explain some of these narratives, which some of them seem a little esoteric or more like fables or folklore, but many of them are actually embedded deeply in history that now is known from archaeology, anthropology, and many other disciplines. And so I've made this kind of a passion of mine to kind of try to put these narratives together from a point of view of how we can explain what the Torah and the Tanakh is actually trying to say. I first of all have to declare that I have no financial or conflicts of interest. This is the series that I've put together, some of which we have already done on these webinars, and some of which are still to come. The various narratives at the beginning, the first four are ones that I've given. The third one is the one I'm giving tonight. The other three and this one are scientific approaches to how to understand various narratives, specifically in Genesis and Exodus. So the first talk about the flood of Noah and Garden of Eden, where and when. We've talked about the creation story from four different aspects and a chidush, or something new, the Purim Passover link. And the dating of the patriarchs and matriarchs today, and the binding of Isaac, which we did a few weeks ago. And the other three, 1, 2, and 4 here, are now on the Beth David website. So if you go to YouTube and type in the name of our shul, which is Beth David, B'nai Israel, Beth Am, you'll come to a very rich, enormous number of different talks that have been given by various members of our clergy and lay members. And in there, you'll find the most recent one is the Akedah. And but further down, a few months earlier, you'll find the other two. And Cora will post this one after it's recorded sometime in the next few days. So if you want to review it, you'll be able to do that. In December, we're going to do number 5, which is a talk that I gave early in April, but was done at a time that I don't think a lot of you would have had a chance to chime in. But it's where the Beit HaMikdash, where the Holy Temple lay. And then a talk on Kabbalah, geometry, and modern geography, which is kind of a fun one that shows how Kabbalah is applied in modern geography. And that one we'll probably do in the new year. And all of these will be posted. And I just wanted to announce that number 7, which is going to be in 2 parts, has to do with hidden meanings in biblical Hebrew, about the letters, the phrases, also some science meets the Bible as well in terms of what's in the text. And I think you'll find that a lot of fun. It's not a pure historical thing, but it's got some tidbits that are going to be a real wow factor for you, as it was for me as I was putting this together. So that's going to be in November. Cora has set those for November 16th and 30th. And so you can put those 2 dates. The one for the Holy Temple will be very timely. She's decided to put that during Hanukkah, which is very appropriate. It was about the holiday of the rededication of the temple. And we will talk about the archaeology of the Temple Mount and where the Beit HaMikdash and the Holy Ark lay in the early days of the Israel Empire. So here are the sciences that we've utilized. I've given you this chart with the last couple of talks, But in order to understand various narratives in the Torah, you have to have some exposure or knowledge of these various sciences. And at the end, I will show you the ones that we've used for this talk, but all of them have been used at various times through the first 4 talks when we deal with the dating of the narratives in the Bible. So as I mentioned, the first 4 talks, including this one, have dealt with these topics: the science behind the creation story, Garden of Eden, the flood epic of Noah, today the dating of the patriarch, matriarch, and the last one I gave on the Akedah and the binding of Isaac. And from those other talks, you will have seen this chart at the end, because the various narratives actually applying the science allow us to date these various events. And if these seem a little bit hard to understand or seem a little bit strange to you, I'll just have to refer you to those talks, and you'll have to go through the narratives that I gave, and you'll find why I feel that the Garden of Eden and Noah's flood are dated as such. And that's going to come into play a little bit later as well in this talk. And the creation of the universe, which from Talmudic and the Midrash and from the Torah, you can actually date the creation of the universe to exactly where science tells us 13.8 billion years ago. And the Exodus from Egypt at 13th century BCE, also derived from the Akedah episode, and I'll leave you to look that up as well. So among that, we're now today going to complete these early 4 talks to dating this particular era. And you'll notice Beth David, B'nai Israel, Beth Am is an egalitarian congregation. We treat genders equally, and so this is not the era of the patriarchs, it's the era of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So I want to make it very clear that we are of equal here. These are some of the references. So if you want to go into these in more detail, you can see the talk online, and then you can go to these references if you'd like. Just to tell you that this is the tip of the iceberg, it's actually the number of sources that I've put into any of these talks, number in the dozens of books and articles, many, many sources in the Talmud and Torah, and from various online sources. But shout out to these are the 5 most important references that I'll be referring to during this talk. And those of you that have been on these journeys with me into history and into the Bible will know that I like including little tidbits in general history. And what's unfortunate about these Zoom webinars is that we can't do it in a group together in a classroom, because we don't have people in person, and I usually like to throw this out and see who might know the answer. But if you look into this, this is something that is the first of its kind. And if you look at it, I will tell you that what you see in this large room is right now in the palm of your hand for most of you. So this was the first computer. This is what the ENIAC looked like, the very first computer in 1948. It occupied a whole room. And from what I've been told, there's about 100 times more power in your iPhone than there was in this entire room at the time. So that shows you how progress has gone. So how are we going to date the patriarch-matriarch age? I'm going to give you a number of different ways of doing this, similar to what we did with the creation story and what we did with the Akedah. So we're going to talk about the prices of slaves over many centuries, the location of the Israelites in Egypt, which in the Torah is listed as Goshen, the geopolitical environment of the early 2nd millennium BCE, the names of individuals and the Yud prefix, inheritance patterns from the Torah and elsewhere, and the structure of treaties, which will very well date where we think the patriarch-matriarch age was. We're going to then talk about the dating the age of Joseph, because you can't really talk about this age without talking about the favored son who became the vizier of Egypt through various coincidences, and finally, the 10 generations from Shem to Abraham. So most people, and you'll see at the end of this talk, that we can talk right now about the most likely time of the patriarch-matriarch age as in the 2nd millennium BCE from many sources. So there are sources that make it likely, and the evidence I'm going to show you is 6 of the items, 6 of those 8 items. However, 2 of the items at the end are actually evidence against this dating, and I'll show you both sides. So we've got a little swivel there, and we're going to be having to see where the balance goes, and I'll let you decide at the end which argument makes more sense. So let's talk about the prices of slaves. From very early on, from the early 3rd millennium, right through till about 500 BCE, there were many civilizations, and we have many texts, many sources, many references from these very early civilizations. And among these documents are numerical issues in terms of markets, in terms of prices of slaves, and in terms of many things that were running in the civilizations at that time. And among the things that are listed in all of these documents over the years are the prices of when slaves were traded among peoples. And you can see that the price, which started down at about 10 shekels, and civil shekels, you can see, was a denomination that went over many centuries, and it increased over the years. The early Babylonia, if we think that the patriarch-matriarch age is somewhere in this, it would match what's in Genesis chapter 37, when Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites for the price of 20 shekels. Later on, compensations for ox goring in Shmot, in Exodus, the price of slaves were a little bit higher, which might date it to closer to this era. And then in the early prophets, in the book of Kings, there's actually taxes for an Israeli captive that were at the value of 50 to 60 shekels. So if we go by that, you can see this is from Kitchen's article in Bar 25 years ago. And you can see that if you plot from lower price to highest price against the eras from the 23rd century BCE through till the 5th century BCE, you can see that the green plot shows you from secular sources, from these other civilizations, what the rate of increase of prices of slaves were. And you can see that the Bible, which is the red source, is actually fairly close to that. And where is there a 20 shekel price is right there. And that's right in the era where Joseph was supposedly sold to the Ishmaelites by his brothers. So that would date things at that point to about 1800 to 1700 BCE. So from the prices of slaves, that would give us a clue as to where to date this narrative. So the best guess is that it was from early Babylonia, from those sources, secular sources, matching the Bible sources, and these sources in early Babylonia come from the 2nd and 3rd century within the 2nd millennium BCE, so about 1800 to 1700 BCE. What about the location of the Israelites in Egypt? Well, when Jacob brought his brood to avoid the famine, after the Pharaoh who had Joseph as his vizier, they lived in this area called the land of Goshen. Goshen was in the northern Nile Delta, and in those places we know from Egyptian sources that there was an area within Goshen called Pi Ramses. These come from Egyptian documents, and these were cities that were built under the auspices of the Pharaoh of the time. And if you look into the book of Shmot, in the early chapters, it lists the 2 cities being built by the Israelites were Pitom and Ramses. And so it gels with what we have from Egyptian sources of Pi Ramses in the same area. It was the area which was settled by Jacob and his family during the time of Joseph. And the archaeological record is intact from the 20th to 16th century BCE for that area, for settlements in that area. There is no record in Egyptian sources in the Eastern Delta here after the 16th century during what we'll call the Hyksos rule. We'll get to that in a moment. It was resettled in the 13th century BCE. So if we're looking at when this area was settled, when these cities were being built, it again localizes it to the early second millennium BCE. Now, what about the geopolitical era? The geopolitics of the time in Mesopotamia, in the early second millennium, there was no single power that ruled the region, and there were really just alliances among 3, 4, or 5 small city-states. After 1750 BCE, Babylonia was the main ruler, and then Assyria, and most of these city-states disappeared. There's no archaeological record of the city-states by those names. And if we look at the Bible in chapter 14 of Genesis, there's actually a list of an alliance during the time of Abraham of Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goyim, who fought an alliance of city-states including Sodom and Amorah, that's Sodom and Gomorrah, which come into the picture later, that were destroyed by God, and Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. And in the subsequent psukim, you still have Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goyim, and they defeated an alliance of several city-states and civilizations. And the one that I want you to note is this one Elam, which manifests in both of these short narratives, both in the ones from 1 to 3 and in 5 to 7. Elam is actually known from ancient sources, and it only existed in a narrow span of ancient history between 2000 and 1800 BCE. This is Elam, and if you look, its capital is a city called Susa, which is in Hebrew called Shushan. And that city may actually give you a little bit of, jog a little memory of a story that we read at Purim, because Shushan was the capital of Ahasuerus's or Artaxerxes' kingdom. And it may or may not be the same city, but it's interesting that it manifests very early in the biblical record. So if we look back and look at Elam being listed in the Bible in these two narratives, it only existed for a 200-year period as far as the archaeological record exists. Now, the next thing is an interesting thing that Kyle McCarter, professor of Bible, actually noted in an article. It's in the references I gave you, and he talked about the biblical names in the narrative. One of the points he makes is that the Yud prefix is very, very common in ancient sources within a certain time context. And before we get to that, I've got another picture for you, another journey into history. I don't know if you'll recognize this gentleman. He's a famous Russian author, and he's talking to his grandchildren. Over 100 years ago, it's one of the latest pictures we have of Leo Tolstoy. So anyhow, the Yud prefix that McCarter references to come from an archive of a civilization from a area known as Mari. Mari is there, a little bit east of Ebla. And about 1933, there was discovery of several thousand documents, stone inscriptions that date to 2000 to 1800 BCE. So that theme is coming up again and again. And in among all these documents are a lot of day-to-day interactions among people and various documents for trade and economy and so on, and many business documents. And they actually list names of people. And it turns out at that time that the Yud was the most common starting letter or vowel for most names in the time of the Amorites. And you find that also in Canaan, in the ancient Jewish land. And this again was very common in the first 200 years of that millennium. Whereas later on, a few centuries later, the Yud prefix is very, very rare. So again, just looking at the names, and look at the biblical names. If you look at our biblical names there, Yitzchak, Yishmael, Yaakov, Yosef, Yisachar, just one after the other of the names that begin with the Yud. So if we have a lot of biblical names with Yud, and the indigenous cultures had several names and many names, the most common prefix starting with a Yud, again, it's a soft sign that this may have also localized it to the early second millennium. What McCarter also notes is that from Amorite records, you actually find the actual name Yaakov, which is the biblical name. Biblical name is Yaakov, and Abram, Abiram, the same variations of Avram, are actually known in inscriptions from their records from that time. And Isaac and Joseph are similar to names, but there's no actual name exactly like Isaac or Joseph, except later on you'll see that there is one. But there are names that are similar, but the closest ones that we have to the actual biblical names are from Amorite records from the early second millennium. What about inheritance patterns? Again, these Mari archives from that same group of people, in the excavation was from a tell called Tel Hariri. And between the 18th and 15th century BCE, they document that the eldest child, starting in the 18th century BCE, started to get a preferential treatment and received 2 times the inheritance of the rest of the children. However, in the 20th century BCE, in these documents from there and others, the shares were actually equal among the children. What about the Bible? What does the Bible say? At the time of Jacob, of Yaakov, in chapter 49 of Genesis, when Yaakov is blessing his sons, there is no indication that Reuven, the eldest, would get an inheritance larger than the rest of the children. So it suggests that there was no pattern of an increased inheritance to the eldest at the time of the patriarchs, which, matching the secular sources, would suggest that we were dealing again with the early second millennium. In Devarim, in Deuteronomy, only after the Exodus and only after the laws that Moses was giving to the people later during their journeys, only then do the laws change and the eldest sons, get twice the share of the rest. So that didn't come in even in Israelite liturgy or literature until after the Exodus. And so before that, there was no indication that at the time of Jacob, that the shares to the sons would be larger to the eldest. Now we come to this is a very interesting analysis that was done by Kitchen in Biblical Archeology, again from the Mari archive. And he talks about an alliance of the treaty with Avram with 3 allies. And there's many treaties that are listed in the early chapters of Bereshit, with Avram and also with Yitzchak. So Avram made an alliance with 3 allies, and they were called Baalei Brit, or part of a covenant to free Lot. A little later in the chapter, Avram makes a treaty with Avimelech and his group. And then Yitzchak also makes a treaty with Avimelech after his men eyed Rivka as his sister. Remember, he tried to pass Rivka as his sister to try to save her, and Avimelech was upset with him, so they made a treaty. And this is a little further along in chapter 26. The Mari archive, again dated to the 2 centuries at the beginning of the second millennium, described the formulas of treaty at that time. And Kitchen actually was able to compare the treaties from these various documents over these many centuries from these various civilizations. And here's where they come from. Akkad and Ebla have a timeline in the third millennium, BCE. The Mari archive, again, early second millennium. The Hittite Empire is the middle of the second millennium BCE, and Assyria is at the beginning of the first millennium BCE. Here's where these various civilizations were located. There is Ebla, which is closer to the Mediterranean coast. There is Akkad. So these are not the Akkadians from Eastern Canada, by the way. They probably had Akkadian cooking, but not Cajun cooking. So these are Akkadian with a double K, not with a C. Elam, again, Elam that existed in the 200 years in the beginning of the second millennium BCE. The Hittites were much further north. They were in the area that is originally ancient Armenia and in currently central Turkey. This is the Hattusa was its capital. And those of you that were with me in the journey through the Noah's flood and the Garden of Eden will remember that this is also the area many, many millennia earlier that is also very close to where the Garden of Eden and the flood of Noah events occurred regarding the Black Sea, which is here, and the highlands of Armenia are here, which is also known as the hills of Ararat. So this is many centuries, many millennia later than those events, but this is in the same area. And so here are some of these civilizations. Assyria is over here with its capital Ashur. And when you look at these various civilizations, I'm sorry to make this looks a little bit complicated, but it's actually, what it shows here are the structures of treaties over many, many centuries. And they're color-coded. This is what Kitchen did for us. They're color-coded with stipulations in blue, oaths in light orange. Light blue are the introductions, and there's also celebrations, commemorations in dark blue. And so all of these treaties have different structures, and all of them have different elements, some of which come from this list. So in the ancient world, the structures of treaties included any or all of these sections: a prologue, or the reasons for the pact; witnesses, which could be physical objects or people; oaths, which bound the parties to this agreement; stipulations that the parties had to follow; sometimes curses, which were penalties for violations that both parties had to agree to; and similarly, blessings, which were mainly hopes for the longevity of the pact between the two parties. And finally, some of them had commemorations. All of them have stipulations, so that's common to all of them. If you compare the various civilizations that listed how their treaties were organized, again, from their common everyday documents and stelae that we see, and from stone carvings and so on, we actually have the structures of how these treaties were built. And you can see that in the 3rd millennium, there were several changes from what were done later on, where the oaths and stipulations actually were consecutive, one after the other, with an oath, a stipulation, an oath, a stipulation, and so on. This model disappeared in the 2nd millennium, where you see the Mari archives give you a straightforward 5 sections. The Hittites had a slightly larger, more elaborate type of pact, and Assyria actually shortened it to 4 sections. So where do the pacts between Avraham and Avimelech and between Yitzchak and Avimelech bring us among this group? So again, stipulations are common to all of them. So here are the components of the treaties between Avraham and Avimelech and Yitzchak and Avimelech from the sources in Bereshit, in Genesis. Pichol was the aide-de-camp for both of them. He's there as a witness. One of the times the witness is God, and then the second again, God is used as a witness. The oaths are slightly different, but they are made again in the verses that I've quoted you. And the stipulations are warnings not to deal falsely or not to do harm. So they're very similar. Curses are in both, to do no harm, and warnings that Avraham gave to Avimelech. And finally, there were commemorations. If you remember, Avraham built an Eshel, which has a bit of controversy of what that is. It may be a plant, it may be a place for sojourning, for lodging, and there were gifts. In the case of Yitzchak and Avimelech, it was a feast. So if these structures are similar, where would these treaties fall in that pantheon? Well, if you look at all of these different options, color-coded, there's only one place where the forefathers' treaties would fall, and that is here, again, matching the Mari archives from 2000 to 1800 BCE. So here we are with the Mari archive. How did their treaties get structured? Well, they had their witnesses as the local deities, just as Avram and Yitzchak used God, Hashem. There were promises binding both parties, just a covenant, similar to a covenant or oath done with these two forefathers. There were stipulations prohibiting hostilities, curses with warnings, just like in the Mari archive, and finally there were feasts and sacrifices. So only in that narrow 200-year window were the structure of treaties similar or exactly parallel to the ones that are described in Genesis. So among these 6, we might now have a chance to sit back and see where the fulcrum, where this balance would go. So I said there's 6 positive facts that would date this to the early 2nd millennium, and these are the 6 that would go along with that. So if we tilt, it looks like the 2nd millennium, early 2nd millennium, is very strongly supported by all this evidence. But we don't know. Is there evidence against that? Well, yes, there are. I said there's 2 items that are a little bit inconsistent with this dating. And that starts with the dating of Joseph. When we talk about Joseph, I'm journeying back into history. Joseph was the second in command of all of Egypt, most powerful country at the time. And this is a journey into history, which is very appropriate for this part of the talk. This is a site in Egypt. And for those of you who might guess what this is, it's a seal of a tomb. And that's what Howard Carter saw before he got into the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922, almost 100 years ago. That's what the unbroken seal looked like when they finally discovered the tomb. So here is the evidence to dating Joseph's time. The prices of slaves and the Yud prefix, just like we dated the era of the Matriarchs and Patriarchs. The Hyksos people, this person by the name of Imhotep, the advisor to the pharaoh, a papyrus called the Ipuwer papyrus, and the inscriptions found in El Arish in the Sinai Peninsula. So we've already been through this. The price of slaves and the Yud prefix, again, when you looked at the price of slaves from the beginning of the talk, over many, many centuries, when you do the comparative analysis, the price of Joseph when he was enslaved, he was 20 shekels that were sold to the Ishmaelites. And that would date him, according to the secular matching data, to the era around 1800 BCE. And the Yud prefix, which is his first letter in his name, again would suggest from naming that the Yud prefix was very common in that era. So from those 2 points of view, it would be consistent with Joseph being in the era just around the end of that 200-year interval. Now, what about the Hyksos? The Hyksos were a foreign people who lived in Asia and invaded Egypt and interrupted the Pharaonic dynasty and were in charge of Egypt for over 100 years. Their capital was in Goshen, and I mentioned that earlier on. So when you see where the Israelites settled, where Jacob's family and his descendants settled, and where the Pi Ramses was built, according to the Egyptian archives, is in Goshen, and its capital was Avaris. And we know in the Bible, in Exodus, very early, that Vayakam melech hadash shelo yada et Yosef, that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Could that refer to a new dynasty which was not Egyptian, but was a foreign power called the Hyksos? It's been put forward as a hypothesis. And if that's the case, that would also be consistent with the dating of Joseph in the late part of that 200-year interval between 2000 and 1800 BCE, because he lived 110 years, and that would nicely gel with the Hyksos. If he lived from 1800, right at the end of, let's say, Jacob's time, to 1690 BCE, it follows just before the Hyksos period, which came a few years later. So that would be supportive. I'd put that on the side of supporting it. But there's a problem. We'll get to the problem in a minute. But as far as the patriarchal age, we also have to account for 400 years of slavery, according to the Tanakh. And that would nicely gel, saying that it's 1800 to 1690. And then they were enslaved for up to 400 years. That would bring us to the 13th century. And according to what we discussed at the Akedah, if it predicted when the giving of the Torah would be, then you're dealing now with the 13th century, and that works very, very nicely. Okay, so what's the problem? The problem is that Egyptian archives actually give us a story of a person who exactly matches the biography, location, and the lifetime of Joseph. And it's this man by the name of Imhotep. Imhotep was a jack of all trades. He was the chancellor and advisor to one of the earliest pharaohs by the name of Djoser. Djoser was a pharaoh of the 4th dynasty in the Old Kingdom, dating to the 27th century BCE. Now, if any of you have been to Cairo, in the area of Cairo, you know, you have the 3 big pyramids. We talked about that last time in the Akedah talk. You'll be able to find that online. But Djoser's pyramid was several hundred years before the 3 main pyramids. His pyramid still exists. It's the stepped pyramid at Memphis, and it dates to about 2650 BCE. And his life is attested by an inscription on his statue, which you can see on the right, and was actually a statue that was found and taken to the Louvre. So if we can ever get back to these museums, if you go to the Egyptian exhibit in the Louvre, you can find this statue. And on the back of the statue, he talks about the people who were his closest aides. And he also talked about this man by the name of Imhotep, who is an architect, physician, and an author of what were called the wisdom texts that were the basis of the kingdom's laws and practices for many centuries afterward. Now, let me show you what these Egyptian texts from the 27th century BCE say, is that Imhotep came to power during a time of famine. It says that the famine stela, which actually comes from the Ptolemaic period, which is from the 3rd century BCE, it describes the legend of a famine in the time of this Djoser that lasted 7 years and was mitigated and solved by Imhotep, where he saved most of the people at that time. This Imhotep lived to 110 years, which is the same as listed in Genesis for Joseph. Imhotep was also given a daughter of the high priest as a wife, exactly what was in the Tales of Joseph, the narrative in the Bible. And this may be the clincher. The name Imhotep is in hieroglyphic, ancient hieroglyphics. But if you look at the pronunciation, we don't know the exact pronunciation, but from more modern hieroglyphics, there's clues that the name Imhotep could be pronounced by Yo-Se-F rather than Ho-Te-Ep. And if you put those together, you get the name Yotzef. The Hebrew name for our hero, is Yosef. And if you want to use a pun, you can say the I apostrophe M in Imhotep means I'm Joseph, or I'm Hotzef. I'm sorry, I think that's a bit of a stretch, but the name could actually be in hieroglyphics very close to the name of Yosef. What about the Ipuwer papyrus? This is another document found in ancient Egypt, and it dates to the Middle Kingdom, which is the 12th dynasty, and that's in the very early 2nd millennium BCE, which describes catastrophes that happened 4 centuries earlier at the end of the Old Kingdom. So that would date to about 2400 or 2300 BCE, which were followed by a chaotic 230 years of an intermediate period in the pharaonic lineage. And you can see on the right, this papyrus was written in ancient hieroglyphics, and it's located in the Netherlands in the museum in Leiden in the Netherlands. Let me show you what this papyrus talks about. And this is just a couple of hundred years after the time of this Imhotep, according to the documents dealing with Djoser. Here is the text from the Ipuwer papyrus talking about these catastrophes. And I've matched it on the right. Again, this comes from the Biblical Archaeology Review article. And look at how close the narratives match. It talks about these catastrophes. In the Ipuwer papyrus, it says the river is blood. And in Exodus, it says the waters of the river were turned to blood. If you go right down, I don't want to read them all to you, but if you look at each of these items, the language is very, very similar. And you can see that they all talk about various plagues and various events that occurred that are documented in Shemot, that are documented in Exodus and in Leviticus. And they match very closely what is in the Ipuwer papyrus that talks about events 400 years before what we think might be the age of the patriarchs, the classic explanation. And what about the El Arish inscriptions? The El Arish is a monument that's dated to the 3rd century BCE, so it's relatively modern in Egyptian history. It was found in El Arish, which is up in the northern Nile Delta, and it was found in the 19th century, and it's thought to be the closest Egyptian account to the story of the parting of the Sea of Reeds. It describes an event in which the Pharaoh of the time dies, and darkness fell on the land of Egypt for 3 days. That's exactly the same as in the plagues in Exodus. It says that this Pharaoh dies in a whirlpool, which means that he was drowned in water in a location called Pi Charoti. In the Bible, in Exodus, when the Pharaoh when he takes his armies and chases after the Israelites as they approach the Sea of Reeds, it says that the Pharaoh reached the Israelites at a location, according to chapter 14, verse 9, called Pi Hachirot, which is exactly the same as the document in the Egyptian document localizes this event. So you could say that maybe this is the El Arish monument is a recapitulation of what is in the Torah. And this is the monument which is in a museum in northern Egypt in the city called Ismailia. And so the question is, does it describe an event in 1500 BCE? The thing is that it's largely discredited by scholars, because if you read through this inscription, it talks about this Pharaoh is warring against some evildoers, not against a fleeing congregation. There is no mention of Israelites, no mention of Hebrews, no mention of a people escaping. It's about a battle of the Pharaoh against a specific type of peoples. We don't know who they were, but it's according to most scholars, it's unlikely that it's relating to the events in the Bible. But it's very interesting that it has certain parallels. And if you want to date when these different anecdotes relate to the time of Joseph and where we would put it, if you're talking about the price of slaves or Yud, or the Hyksos invasion, it actually gels very nicely with what we've talked about earlier on, about all the evidence for the 200 years at the beginning of that second millennium. However, when you see the Imhotep inscriptions and the Ipuwer papyrus, they date those events, if they do have any parallels to what's described in the Bible, to several centuries before that. So that would sort of go against the dating of Joseph to the second millennium. The El Arish inscriptions, we really don't know exactly when they would refer to, so they really don't help us in the dating. And what about now the 10 generations from Shem to Avraham? According to the narratives in Bereshit, in Genesis, in chapter 11, verses 10 to 32, there's 11 generations from Noach to Avram. And so after Noach, starting with Shem, there are 10 generations that go through from Shem to Avraham. Now, those of you that were with me for the Noah and flood lecture will see a very similar chart to this one, because I gave you the 10 generations from Adam to Noach to talk about the timing between the events of Adam and the events of Noah and when we would date the Garden of Eden. So this is a similar analysis, but these are now the next 10 generations, starting with Noach and Shem, his son, and going through down to the era of Avram. These are the total number of years that these people lived. Now, this is the era taking us from Noah, from Noah's flood, to the time of Avram. Okay? Here are the ages of these people. You can see that actually it's interesting that their ages, which were enormous early on, are starting to get less and less, starting to approach what are normal human lifespans, which is quite interesting. And you can say that if we add up all these years, we should be able to get the length of time of these 10 generations. However, that's the wrong analysis. It's the same thing I told you and we discussed when we talked about the generations from Adam to Noah. You can't add the times of their lifespans to find out how many years has elapsed. You have to use the overlapping ages, because son number 2 was born during the lifetime of person 1. Son number 3 was born during the lifetime of person 2. Person 4 is born during the lifetime of 3. And so to get the true time elapsed, you have to use the overlapping ages, which the Torah nicely obliges us and gives us, and you have to add them up to get the actual years that have elapsed. So if you look at this chart, you cannot use that column. That just tells you their lifespans. You have to use this column where I put for you the age of the birth. How old were each of those individuals at the time of the birth of the next generation? And when you add them up, it's 390 years, almost 400 years. So according to the Bible, according to the Torah, it was 400 years from Noah to Avram. Problem. We said from the talk on Noah and the flood, so you'll have to go to find where the evidence I present of the timing of the flood of Noah is in the 7th millennium BCE, but no later, according to marine archaeology, it's no later than 5500 BCE. So if there's 10 generations from 5500 BCE, when Noah and his family exit the ark, to 2000 BC, the Torah only accounts for 390 years. Something doesn't work. There's 3,500 years, of which only about 15% of those years is accounted for by the Torah. I have no answer. I'm just going to leave that as an enigma. But it's certainly, when you look at all this evidence, where does it put the age of the matriarchs and patriarchs? I said 6 pieces of evidence, and maybe one of the pieces of evidence or 2 from the Joseph issue would put us that it's very likely in the 2nd millennium BCE. However, the historical Joseph, where did he live and who was he? And is he actually the Imhotep figure, or is he a separate figure about which there is no Egyptian documentation, which is a problem for scholars, because you'd expect somebody with that amount of power and who made such a contribution to saving people during a 7-year famine that there be some documentation. But like anything in archaeology, not everything has been discovered. And absence of evidence is not the evidence for absence, if people use that figure or that adage. So there may be eventually some discovery that will conclusively tell us when Joseph lived. But there's some evidence against that being the prototypical Joseph. And the years from Shem to Abraham do not gel at all with the marine archaeology and the evidence from archaeological sources. So we're a bit tippy. I like to think that we're basically most likely looking at the 2nd millennium BCE, the early 2nd millennium, most likely, but you have to know that the evidence is not absolutely conclusive. So it tells us that most likely we're looking at the 200 years early in the 2nd millennium. And as I mentioned in the Akedah talk, that when you look at the middle of the 13th century BCE as the likely time of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah, that we're looking at about 400 years of slavery. That's nicely accounted by that, as I mentioned before. And you can nicely slip in the 110 years of Joseph right there and have a beautiful timeline that gels with all the evidence that I've given you. So this is the sort of conclusion of the science behind this. And now lifting at all of these areas of science, here are the pieces of science that we've had, the evidence from science that we've had to use in order for us to be able to put this science together. So again, we've now gone through the 4 talks that have dated these various narratives of Genesis. I look forward for you joining me on the journey through the hidden messages in biblical Hebrew, which we will do November, those of you that missed the beginning, these will be in November 16th and 30th on Mondays from 8 to 9 Eastern. It'll be kind of daylight time, I guess. Don't forget to move your clocks whenever we do. And we'll delve into that. And those are going to be 2 very fun talks. I couldn't figure all the stuff I wanted to do, I could not fit into one talk. So I've split it into 2 talks. And some of it is going to astound you as to just how rich the biblical Hebrew and letters and so on are. And then later on in December, during Hanukkah, we're going to do the Holy Temple. And then early in the new year, I'll finish the series with another reprise of Kabbalah, geometry, and modern geography. And you can see I've already updated it to 5781 as the Odyssey. So I'm glad you're on this journey with me. I'm happy to take any questions. We can unmute. And again, thank you for joining us. And thanks, Cora, for being my aide-de-camp here and being my Imhotep here for my talk here. And I hope you all stay safe and stay well and keep wearing your masks. And also, very important, get your flu shots. And those of you over 65, make sure it's the double dose. It's going to be more important this year than ever. So that's my medical soapbox. So anyhow, thank you all for coming. And I hope that you found this interesting and challenging. And there's lots of questions still to answer. Thank you very much.